Hey friends, welcome back to the Crooked Spoon. I'm so glad you're here. Today I'm going to show you how to make a loaf of brioche bread. I'm starting by getting my milk ready, 60 grams, to scald on the stove. It's important to do this first because I need it to cool down next. This first step is setting up a sponge for our dough. Because the brioche has a lot of fat content from eggs and butter, we consider this a rich dough. We use a sponge method to help encourage the yeast to develop long before the first and second rising, the first and second proofing stage, which gives it a much better flavor and a lot more gluten, which makes the dough both soft and stable. So to make the sponge, first we add 60 grams of bread flour and 6 grams of yeast to that 60 grams of scalded and cooled milk. The idea here is that we will let that rise and proof to pre-ferment before we make our main dough. It's important not to use hot scalded milk because that could essentially kill the yeast and prevent it from rising. So I'm putting mine in an ice bath so that I know it gets to a good temperature before I make the sponge. I'm using instant yeast that I do keep in my refrigerator. And as always, I'll include the recipe below in the show notes. When it comes to making bread, there are several different terms that different cultures use for their starter or their pre-fermenter. There is something we call poolish, which is a more liquidy pre-fermenter. There is something called biga, which is often used for Italian doughs. There's also levain, which is the term that sourdough bakers use. And for my recipe here, we're essentially making a sponge, and that's often the term used for sweetbreads and pastries. And again, it's just giving the yeast more time to ferment, which results in a deeper, nicer, richer flavor and a better texture in your product. Once I've mixed my bread flour, my milk, and my yeast, it's quite thick. The plan is to let this ferment and bubble and rise for about 90 minutes at least. And you'll know it's done because it'll be bubbly and fluffy. I'm going to cover it with some saran wrap. I always like to put a time stamp on it so that if I get distracted or lose track of time, I know exactly when I've begun. And I'm going to put this either in my oven with the oven light on, which makes for a nice warm environment, or up high on a shelf. Now let's see what it looks like. There you go. Bubbly, oozy. You know it's done. That yeast is working. All right, and now we get started with the next steps. Here's a great reminder that when you have a recipe that requires a little more attention, that we get ourselves organized, right? The French term mise en place. So I'm assembling all of the ingredients that I'm going to need for the next set of steps, and that everything will be within arm's reach for me when it comes time. So I've measured out 240 grams of bread flour. I'm currently measuring out 15 grams of sugar. If you don't already have a kitchen scale, I encourage you to get one. Makes for very accurate recipes. I'll be putting in 6 grams of kosher salt. The yield for this recipe is a brioche loaf that's 1.5 pounds, or about 720 grams. Next up are my eggs. This recipe calls for 150 grams of egg. An individual extra large egg can be about 50 grams. But sometimes you do have to add a little more or take a little out. It's not always exact, especially when you're scaling a recipe up or down. And that's where measuring on a digital scale comes in really handy. You can't get any more accurate than that. Okay, so as I mentioned before, brioche is considered a rich dough, meaning it contains a lot of fat from butter and eggs. So this recipe has a good amount of butter in it. Here I am weighing out 180 grams of softened, room temperature, unsalted butter. I would say this is probably the trickiest part of the recipe, in that it takes a lot of time to incorporate this butter into the dough. And you'll see that when I start using my KitchenAid mixer, how long it can actually take for all of that butter to be absorbed. So while it's a very straightforward recipe, it's a little bit of a time-consuming recipe. So I've got 180 grams of softened butter, and now I'm ready to start assembling. So in my stand mixer bowl right now is that sponge that we created. And to that sponge, I'm going to gradually and slowly mix in my eggs. And these are very important steps that take time. I don't want to overdo adding in the eggs because it will sort of flood or overwhelm that sponge. Now, as I've said in other videos, when you're using a KitchenAid and we're incorporating butter and eggs, it's very important to have a little scraper. I love these mini spatulas. The paddle will do so much of the work for us, but we have to be sure that the ingredients are coming off the sides of the bowl and being mixed properly. Okay, at this point in the video, I'm going to speed up. I've now fully incorporated my eggs, and I'm ready to add my dry ingredients, which includes the bread flour, the sugar, and the salt. My paddle is doing a lot of the work in this recipe. This dough is going to get thick and sticky. Again, scraping down the sides, scraping off my paddle, making sure that the sponge with the eggs is mixing in well with my dry ingredients. Very thick, very sticky. This stand mixer is worth its weight in gold. Oh boy, are we spoiled, especially when making breads, letting our stand mixers do all of the work. All right, so at this stage, I need to incorporate 180 grams of softened butter. And what I did was, to set my pace, I set my oven timer for 15 minutes. And I know that sounds extreme, but that's exactly how long it's going to take to slowly incorporate all of that butter into that dough. And so by setting that timer, it helps me realize how little at a time I need to add while this mixer is doing all of the work. Now I have a traditional brioche loaf pan, fluted, and although the dough is very buttery, I did butter that up, right? We want that to be able to come out very easy once it's baked. And I cannot emphasize how sticky this dough is. These scrapers do an amazing job of getting everything off the sides of the bowl, because my next step is to dump this sticky dough out onto my counter and prepare it for the fluted pan. Let's get all those last bits incorporated. And now we're ready to roll out the dough. I'm going to be sure to include a product link for these dough scrapers, these bowl scrapers. They really are so handy when baking. And I'm also going to include a link for that brioche pan. There are many modified pans you can use for brioche. You really could roll it up and put it in a 9x5 pan. I've seen bakers make sort of a swirl, a free-form swirl, and bake it on a cookie sheet with parchment. But I'm going with the traditional brioche loaf today. So I'm going to put my dough into my next bowl. As you know, bread takes a long time, a lot of downtime, a lot of rest time for the yeast to ferment. And we're going to wait for this dough to proof. And you'll know it's done when you make an indentation with your finger and it comes, or I shouldn't say, it stays indented. The indentation does not come out. All right, because this is such a sticky dough, I've put some bench flour down, just bread flour. And now it hasn't doubled in size like you would imagine other breads, because this is a very rich dough. This has a lot of sugar, a lot of egg, a lot of butter. And so it's not going to get airy and fluffy like a lean dough would. A lean dough is a dough that doesn't have as much fat and sugar. Think like a baguette or our traditional white sandwich bread. But I know this one is done because my finger indented and it stayed indented in the dough. Definitely getting my hands floured up, right? I don't want to stick to the dough. And the traditional thing to do is to sort of roll this. And it's always a balance of enough flour so it doesn't stick, but you do want some friction of the counter. And I'm essentially going to roll it into a little bit of a log, kind of like a cone shape. But you want to split a piece off the top. You may have heard this term, actually. It's a Parisian term for the brioche called brioche à tête. So it's a very traditional way of making a brioche loaf. And the brioche à tête, tête means head in French. So I'm essentially twisting a head onto this loaf of brioche. So I'm rolling it to be smooth and then twisting to have this extra piece, the head, brioche à tête. And I put the base into the fluted pan, and I'm essentially making a big indentation to rest the tête in, the head. Now, as most bread recipes require, this is going to have a second proof, and then it'll bake in a 375-degree oven for about 25 minutes, or for an internal temperature of about 190. And look at this beautiful brioche à tête. Thanks so much for watching, friends. I'll see you in the next video.